The Apex Defense Institute sat perched on the edge of Nexus Prime like a monument to civilized violence, which, when you really think about it, is the most beautifully contradictory concept the galaxy has ever produced. Its gleaming spires caught the light of 3 different suns, each one illuminating another wing dedicated to teaching various species how to kill each other with proper form and appropriate documentation. Captain Holland stood at the observation deck, watching the morning's combat drills with the weary satisfaction of a man who'd spent the better part of 20 years teaching aliens that humans weren't as fragile as they looked. Not that most of them listened, mind you. The galaxy had a peculiar blind spot when it came to species that didn't tower over everything else or sport natural weaponry that could punch through starship hulls. Below him, the main training floor buzzed with activity. A group of Centaurian cadets, those 4-armed, blue-skinned giants who looked like someone had crossed a bodybuilder with a particularly aggressive thunderstorm, were practicing submission holds on some unfortunate volunteers from the Deltan Confederation. The Deltans, bless their crystalline hearts, kept trying to apply logic to combat situations, which worked about as well as you'd expect when facing opponents who considered think first, punch second to be a character flaw. "Another batch of transfers coming in today," announced Lieutenant Corvex, sliding up beside Holland with that peculiar grace that only came from having tentacles instead of legs. His translator box crackled slightly as it converted his native clicking into Standard Galactic. 3 Vorthak warriors, 2 Shi'Tar assassins, and... He paused, checking his datapad with what Holland had learned to recognize as barely concealed amusement. 1 human. Holland raised an eyebrow. Just 1? Just 1. Mid-semester transfer from the outer colonies. Military background, but no formal academy training. Corvex's tentacles writhed in what passed for a shrug among his species. Command seems to think she'll provide educational value. The way he said it made Holland's blood pressure tick up a notch. In his experience, when Command talked about educational value, it usually meant someone was about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating the wrong species. Down on the training floor, a commotion had broken out near the sparring rings. The unmistakable sound of something very large hitting something very solid echoed through the chamber, followed by the kind of roar that suggested someone's pride had been damaged, along with their ribcage. Standing over a groaning Centaurian cadet was Gorthak, all 8 feet and 6 inches of scaled, muscled, utterly unpleasant Skarex warrior. His reptilian features twisted into what might have been a smile if you were feeling particularly generous with your interpretations. The ridge of bone that ran from his forehead to the back of his skull caught the light like a crown of violence, and his yellow eyes swept the gathered crowd with the lazy confidence of a predator who'd never met anything he couldn't tear apart. "Anyone else?" Gorthak's voice rumbled through the training hall like distant thunder. His Standard Galactic carried that particular accent that made every word sound like a threat. Perhaps one of the soft species would like to demonstrate their techniques? The gathered cadets shifted uncomfortably. Gorthak had arrived at the academy 6 months ago with a reputation that preceded him like a particularly unpleasant smell. On his homeworld of Skarex Prime, he'd earned the title Bone Crusher after winning 43 consecutive gladiatorial matches, each one ending with his opponent requiring extensive medical reconstruction. The Skarex Empire had sent him to the academy not to learn, but to demonstrate why their species deserved a higher position in the Galactic Defense Coalition's hierarchy. So far, he was making a compelling argument. Holland watched a young Andromedan cadet, one of those graceful, ethereal beings who looked like they'd been carved from moonlight and good intentions, take a single step backward. Smart kid. Andromedans were telepathic healers, not fighters, and going toe-to-toe with Gorthak would be like bringing a meditation cushion to a demolition derby. No volunteers? Gorthak's tongue flicked out to taste the air, a habit that never failed to unnerve the mammals in the crowd. How disappointing! I was hoping the Academy's reputation for producing warriors was more than just clever marketing. Lieutenant Korvex's tentacles tightened around his datapad. Someone should step in before this gets out of hand. Holland was about to agree when the main doors to the training hall hissed open, and the morning transfer students filed in. The Vorthak warriors entered first, 3 beings that looked like someone had taught a boulder how to walk, and then given it anger management issues. They surveyed the scene with the kind of professional interest that suggested they were already calculating which bones would break first if things went sideways. The Shi'Tar assassins followed, moving with that liquid grace that made everyone else in the room suddenly aware of how many vital organs they were carrying around unprotected. Their obsidian skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their presence made the temperature in the room drop a few degrees. And then, bringing up the rear like an afterthought, came the human. She was, well, ordinary was probably the kindest word for it. Maybe 5.5 feet tall, with brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and the kind of build that suggested she spent more time running than lifting heavy objects. Her uniform was crisp, her posture was correct, and absolutely nothing about her appearance suggested she could handle anything more dangerous than a strongly worded memo. Gorthak's yellow eyes locked onto her immediately, and his smile widened to show far too many teeth. "Well," he rumbled, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet training floor, "look what we have here. A little pink mammal, lost so far from home." The human, Jamie, according to Korvex's datapad, didn't react to the comment. She simply stood at attention with the rest of the transfer students, waiting for instructions. Her face showed nothing more than polite interest, as if she were attending a lecture on stellar cartography, rather than being sized up by a predator who outweighed her by roughly 300 pounds. "Instructor Vexahol," Gorthak called out to the Rigelian combat instructor who was supposed to be running the orientation. "Perhaps our new human friend would like to demonstrate some of her species' famous adaptability." Instructor Vexhal, a 7-foot-tall insectoid who looked like a praying mantis that had been hitting the gym, clicked his mandibles nervously. The Rigelians were excellent fighters, but they were also excellent at recognizing when a situation was about to spiral completely out of control. "The transfer students are here for orientation, not combat assessment," Vexhal replied, his translator rendering his clicks into careful, diplomatic standard galactic. "Perhaps we should—" "Oh, come now," Gorthak interrupted, taking a step toward the group of transfer students. The Vorthak warriors and Shi'Tar assassins parted like water, giving him a clear path to Jamie. "I'm sure she's eager to show us what humanity brings to the table. After all, your species has such a reputation for— what was it? Cunning?" The way he said the word made it sound like an insult. Jamie finally looked up, meeting Gorthak's gaze with calm, dark eyes. "I'm here to learn, not to entertain," she said quietly. Her voice carried just enough edge to suggest that while she might be polite, she wasn't particularly impressed. This, as Holland could have predicted, was exactly the wrong thing to say to someone like Gorthak. The Skarex warrior's head tilted slightly, the way a cat might study a particularly interesting mouse. "Learn? From us?" He gestured around the training hall, taking in the various species of students who were all trying very hard to blend into the background. "Tell me, little mammal, what exactly does your species think it can learn from those who were born to fight?" Proper technique, Jamie replied without hesitation. Discipline. How to follow orders without getting my teammates killed. A few of the other students exchanged glances. It was a textbook answer, exactly what any military instructor would want to hear. It was also, Holland realized with growing unease, delivered with the kind of flat, matter-of-fact tone that suggested she'd given it some thought. Gorthak's laugh was like gravel in a cement mixer. Teammates, child, the only thing standing between you and death in real combat is your own. Strength. Everything else is just pretty words for the recruitment brochures. He took another step closer, close enough that Jamie had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The size difference was almost comical, a child facing down a mountain. But perhaps, Gorthak continued, his voice dropping to something that might have been conversational if you ignored the underlying promise of violence, you'd like to demonstrate this famous human adaptability? A simple sparring session. Nothing too strenuous. Just enough to show everyone what your species is truly capable of. The training hall had gone completely silent. Even the background hum of the ventilation system seemed to have paused, waiting to see how this would play out. Jamie looked around the room, taking in the faces of her fellow students. Some showed pity, others curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of anticipation that suggested they were already placing bets on how long she'd last. When her gaze reached the observation deck, she made brief eye contact with Holland, who found himself holding his breath. "I appreciate the offer," Jamie said finally, turning back to Gorthak. "But I think I'll pass. First day and all." For a moment, Holland thought that might be the end of it. Gorthak would make a few more threats, Jamie would continue being politely evasive, and eventually Instructor Vexhal would find an excuse to move the orientation somewhere else. Then Gorthak reached out with one massive, clawed hand and placed it on Jamie's shoulder. Not hard enough to hurt, but heavy enough to make a point. His fingers, each one roughly the size of a small wrench, pressed against her collarbone with just enough pressure to suggest what he could do if he decided to apply more force. "I'm afraid," he said, his voice still conversational, "that I wasn't really asking." The smile never left his face. The next 3 days at the Apex Defense Institute passed with the kind of deceptive calm that usually preceded someone doing something spectacularly stupid. Jamie had managed to extract herself from Gorthak's friendly introduction without any broken bones, though the way she'd done it, a polite, "Excuse me," followed by stepping backward just far enough to make his grip awkward, had left the Scarex warrior looking like someone had stolen his favorite chew toy. Now, watching her stumble through the basic combat simulations, Holland was beginning to wonder if Command had finally lost what remained of their collective minds. "Left foot forward, Corporal," barked Instructor Vexihal as Jamie attempted to navigate the obstacle course for the 3rd time that morning. "You're telegraphing your movements like a distress beacon." Jamie nodded, adjusted her stance, and promptly tripped over a low barrier that a particularly uncoordinated Andromedan had cleared without difficulty. She rolled with the fall, decent enough technique there, but came up looking winded and slightly embarrassed. From his position near the advanced sparring rings, Gorthak's laughter rumbled across the training floor like distant artillery. "Perhaps the humans should have sent someone else," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This one seems better suited for clerical work." A few of the other students chuckled, though most had the good sense to keep their amusement quiet. The Vorthak warriors, those walking boulders with attitude problems, exchanged what might have been meaningful looks if you could read expressions carved from granite. Even the Shi'Tar assassins, who typically treated emotional displays like personal weaknesses, seemed to find the situation mildly entertaining. Holland frowned checking Jamie's file on his datapad for the 15th time that week. Military background from the Kepler 442b mining colonies, it said. Combat experience listed as extensive. Recommended for advanced training by… And here's where things got interesting. Captain Marcus Steele, who Holland knew by reputation as someone who wouldn't recommend his own mother for advanced training unless she could bench press a hover tank. Something didn't add up. "Hey," said a soft, clicking voice beside him. Yenth, the Academy's only Zarathian student, had approached with that peculiar sideways scuttle that his species used when they were nervous. His compound eyes, each one the size of a dinner plate, were focused on the training floor with obvious concern. Is it just me, or does she seem different when she thinks no one's watching? Holland followed Yenth's gaze. Jamie had finished the obstacle course, dead last, naturally, and was now standing off to the side, ostensibly catching her breath. But her posture was wrong for someone who was winded, too balanced, too ready, and her eyes were tracking Gorthak's movements with the kind of focus that suggested she was memorizing every step, every gesture, every tell. Different how? Holland asked. Yenth's mandibles clicked nervously. Yesterday, during combat theory class, Professor Zenth was explaining Skarek's anatomy. Pressure points, joint articulation, that sort of thing. Standard curriculum stuff. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She already knew it. All of it. I caught her mouthing the answers before the professor asked the questions. Interesting. Holland made a mental note to review the classroom recordings later. Down on the training floor, Gorthak had finished demolishing his latest sparring partner, a Rigelian cadet who would probably be eating through a straw for the next week, and was looking around for fresh entertainment. His gaze settled on Jamie, with the kind of predatory interest that made everyone else in the immediate vicinity find urgent business elsewhere. "Human!" he called out, cracking his knuckles with sounds like small explosions. "Since you've finished your exercise, perhaps you'd like to observe some real combat techniques." Jamie looked up from where she'd been adjusting her equipment harness. "I'm always eager to learn," she replied politely. "Excellent." Gorthak's smile showed far too many teeth. Yorth, front and center. One of the Vorthak warriors, the one who looked like someone had taught a meteorite to walk, stepped forward. Yorth stood nearly as tall as Gorthak, but was built like a siege engine, all broad shoulders and crushing weight. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where the local predators could bite through starship hulls, and it showed in every line of his massively overbuilt frame. Standard grappling rules, Gorthak announced to the gathered students. First, to submit or lose consciousness wins. Educational purposes only. The way he said it suggested that his definition of educational might require medical supervision. What followed was less a demonstration and more a natural disaster with limbs. Yorth might have been built like a fortress, but Gorthak moved like liquid violence, flowing around the Vorthak's attacks with serpentine grace before striking with surgical precision. Within 90 seconds, Yorth was tapping out from a hold that had bent his arm in directions that definitely weren't covered in standard anatomical texts. "You see," Gorthak said, releasing his opponent and turning to address the crowd. "Superior technique combined with natural advantages. This is how real warriors fight." His eyes found Jamie in the crowd. Of course, some species are more naturally suited to combat than others. Wouldn't you agree, Corporal? Jamie nodded thoughtfully. Absolutely. Natural advantages make a significant difference. Indeed, size, strength, natural weapons. Gorthak flexed his claws for emphasis. These things cannot be taught or overcome through clever tactics. No argument here, Jamie agreed. A smaller, weaker opponent would need to be very lucky to win against someone like you. Holland felt his stomach drop. In his experience, when someone started agreeing with their potential opponent about how outmatched they were, it usually meant one of two things. Either they were genuinely terrified, or they were setting up for something spectacularly unpleasant. Given Jamie's file and the growing suspicion that there was more to her background than a few lines of military service records, he was betting on the latter. Gorthak, naturally, interpreted her agreement as submission. His chest swelled with pride as he gestured around the training floor. Precisely. The natural order exists for a reason. Predators hunt, prey runs, and the strong inherit the galaxy. Makes perfect sense, Jamie said, and then, with the kind of innocent curiosity that should have set off every alarm bell in Gorthak's reptilian brain, added, I'm curious, though, how does formal sparring compare to real combat? I imagine the rules change quite a bit when someone's actually trying to kill you. Several students shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't the kind of question most Academy cadets asked during their first week. Gorthak's smile widened. An excellent question. Real combat is faster, more brutal, and infinitely less forgiving than anything we practice here. There are no referees, no safety protocols, and no second chances. He paused, studying her face. Why do you ask? Planning to apply your newfound knowledge somewhere? Jamie shrugged. Just trying to understand the practical applications. Back home, we had a saying. Training teaches you how to fight, but fighting teaches you how to survive. Wise words, Gorthak rumbled approvingly. Your species may be physically inferior, but you occasionally demonstrate flashes of intelligence. Where exactly did you serve, Corporal? Kepler 442b. Mining Colony Security. Ah. Gorthak's expression suggested he'd just solved a particularly easy puzzle. Crowd control and equipment protection. Very different from actual warfare. Jamie nodded again. Very different. Though the mining colonies do have their own unique challenges. Holland caught the pause before unique challenges and felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Kepler 442b wasn't just any mining colony. It was one of the frontier worlds, the kind of place where the Galactic Council's authority extended exactly as far as the nearest patrol ship, and patrol ships had a habit of being elsewhere when you needed them most. It was also, if he remembered correctly, the site of the infamous Darwin Pits. The Darwin Pits, where desperate colonists had built underground fighting arenas and packed them with the galaxy's most dangerous predators. Where humans had learned to fight not for sport or glory, but for survival. Where the local authorities had turned a blind eye because it kept the worst elements of the colonial population busy killing each other instead of causing real trouble. The Darwin Pits, which had been shut down by a joint Council-Empire task force after holovid footage of the matches had leaked onto the galactic networks, causing public outrage and a series of rather embarrassing questions about frontier law enforcement. Holland pulled up Jamie's service record again, this time looking for details he'd missed the first time. Born on Kepler 442b. Parents listed as deceased. No extended family on record. Military service began at age 18, immediately after the Darwin Pits incident. Son of a bitch, he muttered under his breath. What? Yenth asked, his compound eyes swiveling toward Holland with insectoid curiosity. Before Holland could answer, Gorthak's voice boomed across the training floor. Well then, Corporal Jamie of Kepler 442b, perhaps you'd be interested in a more practical demonstration? The way he said it made every other conversation in the room stop dead. Jamie tilted her head slightly. What kind of demonstration? Simple combat exercise. You and me, basic grappling rules, strictly for educational purposes. Gorthak's smile was all predator now. I could show you firsthand how real warriors handle inferior opponents. The training floor had gone completely silent again. Even the background hum of the air recycling system seemed to pause, as if the entire facility was holding its breath. Jamie looked around the room, taking in the faces of her fellow students. Most showed varying degrees of concern, pity, or morbid curiosity. A few of the more sadistic species were already leaning forward in anticipation. When her gaze reached the observation deck, she made eye contact with Holland. For just a moment, her carefully maintained expression of nervous uncertainty slipped, and Holland saw something else underneath. Something that looked very much like anticipation. I appreciate the offer, Jamie said, turning back to Gorthak with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. But I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of instruction. Nonsense, Gorthak replied, taking a step closer. The best way to learn is through direct experience. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? A few bruises, perhaps a minor fracture or two. Nothing that won't heal. Jamie hesitated, and Holland could practically see the internal calculation happening behind her eyes. Finally, she sighed in apparent resignation. Well, if you think it would be educational. Excellent! Gorthak clapped his hands together with a sound like gunshots. Instructor Vexahal, please clear the main sparring ring. It's time for our human friend to receive a proper education in practical combat applications. As the other students moved to form a circle around the sparring ring, Holland found himself gripping the observation deck railing hard enough to leave fingerprints in the metal. Whatever was about to happen, he had a feeling it was going to rewrite a few assumptions about human capabilities, and possibly a few medical textbooks. The main sparring ring at the Apex Defense Institute had seen its share of violence over the years, but nothing quite like the electric tension that filled the air as Jamie and Gorthak stepped onto the padded combat platform. The assembled students formed a loose circle around the ring, their conversations reduced to nervous whispers and the occasional click or growl of anticipation. Instructor Vexahal stood at the edge of the ring, his mandibles twitching as he reviewed the safety protocols on his datapad. Standard grappling rules apply, he announced, his translator rendering his clicks into crisp, standard galactic. No strikes to vital organs, no intentional bone breakage, and the match ends when one participant submits or loses consciousness. Jamie nodded politely, rolling her shoulders to loosen up. She'd changed into standard academy sparring gear, lightweight padding over a moisture-wicking bodysuit that made her look even smaller than usual. Next to Gorthak, who wore minimal protection over his natural scaled hide, she resembled a child playing dress-up in her parents' equipment. "Any questions before we begin?" Vexahal asked, though his tone suggested he hoped someone would call the whole thing off. "Just one," Jamie said, raising her hand like a student in class. "When you say no intentional bone breakage, does that include dislocations?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several students exchanged glances, and Holland found himself leaning forward against the observation deck railing. Gorthak's laugh rumbled through the training hall. "Planning to dislocate something, little mammal? I admire your optimism, even if it's tragically misplaced." "Just want to be clear on the rules," Jamie replied, with the kind of innocent smile that should have triggered every survival instinct Gorthak possessed. Naturally, it didn't. "Dislocations are permitted," Vexahal said reluctantly, "though I must stress that this is meant to be an educational exercise, not—" "Understood," both fighters said simultaneously, though they were clearly understanding very different things. The two combatants moved to opposite sides of the ring. Gorthak rolled his massive shoulders, producing a series of pops that sounded like someone snapping tree branches. His yellow eyes never left Jamie's face, and his forked tongue flicked out to taste the air with obvious pleasure. Jamie, meanwhile, was going through what appeared to be a basic stretching routine. Ankle rolls, knee bends, the kind of warm-up exercises you'd see in any fitness center across the galaxy. Nothing that suggested she was preparing to fight for her life against a predator who outweighed her by 300 pounds. "Fighters ready?" Vexahal called out. Gorthak dropped into a combat stance that would have looked at home in any gladiatorial arena. Low center of gravity, clawed hands extended, every line of his body radiating controlled violence. "Ready!" Jamie finished her stretching and stood up straight, hands loose at her sides. If you didn't know better, you might think she was waiting for someone to explain the rules again. "Ready. Begin!" What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and completely misunderstood by military strategists for the next 50 years. Gorthak moved first, as everyone expected. His species hadn't conquered half the outer rim by waiting for their opponents to make the opening move. He lunged forward with surprising speed, for something his size, his right hand reaching out to grab Jamie's shoulder, the same shoulder he'd claimed during their first encounter. It was a simple, effective opening. Grab the opponent, establish control, then use superior strength and leverage to end the fight quickly. The kind of technique that had worked for Gorthak in 43 consecutive gladiatorial matches. His clawed fingers closed around Jamie's left shoulder with the satisfied precision of a predator claiming its prey. And that's when the galaxy learned something new about human anatomy. Jamie didn't try to break the grip. She didn't attempt to twist away or retreat. Instead, she shifted her weight, just a subtle movement that redistributed her balance from both feet to primarily her right foot. And everything that followed happened with the kind of mechanical inevitability that would make a physics professor weep tears of joy. The human shoulder, as it turns out, is a remarkable piece of evolutionary engineering. It's designed for maximum range of motion rather than maximum strength, which means it can move in ways that would make other species' joints seize up in protest. It also means that when you grab a human by the shoulder, you're not actually controlling their center of mass the way you think you are. Jamie rotated her left shoulder down and back, slipping Gorthak's grip just enough to create space, then snapped her body forward and up in a motion that was part martial arts technique and part applied physics lesson. Her right elbow, moving with all the force that her shifted weight could provide, connected with Gorthak's extended collarbone with surgical precision. The sound was like a gunshot. Gorthak's roar of pain and surprise shook the training hall windows. He staggered backward, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle, his yellow eyes wide with shock, and the kind of pain that suggested several important structural elements had just rearranged themselves without permission. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. The training hall fell silent except for Gorthak's labored breathing and the quiet hum of the air recycling systems. Every student, instructor, and observer stood frozen, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Jamie straightened up, brushing off her sparring gear with casual efficiency. "I think that counts as a dislocation," she said conversationally. "Though, technically, a broken collarbone is a fracture, not a dislocation. Should we call it a draw?" Holland felt his jaw drop. Around the ring, expressions ranged from shock to confusion to the kind of dawning comprehension that suggested several assumptions about human capabilities were currently being revised. Instructor Vexahal was the first to recover. rushing forward with a medical scanner while signaling for the emergency response team. "Medical to training ring 1, he called into his communicator. "Significant fracture. Possible internal?" "I'm fine," Gorthak growled, though his voice was strained and his scales had gone several shades paler. He looked at Jamie with something that might have been respect, if it wasn't mixed with so much confusion. "How did you— What was that technique?" Jamie shrugged, the motion perfectly casual, despite having just disabled a warrior who'd spent his entire life learning how to kill things. "Basic leverage. You grabbed my shoulder, so I used your grip as a fulcrum point. Elementary physics, really." "Elementary physics," repeated Yenth from somewhere in the crowd, his compound eyes blinking rapidly. "She just said elementary physics." The medical team arrived, a collection of various species who specialized in putting warriors back together after they'd been enthusiastically taken apart. They surrounded Gorthak with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first Scarex-related incident. "Compound fracture of the clavicle," announced the lead medic, a Deltan whose crystalline structure made him ideal for diagnostic work. "Clean break, though. Should heal completely with proper treatment." Gorthak submitted to their ministrations with the stunned compliance of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly rearranged. He kept staring at Jamie as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Commander Hale chose that moment to make her entrance, striding into the training hall with the kind of authority that made everyone automatically stand a little straighter. Her sharp features took in the scene: injured Scarex warrior, confused students, and one perfectly calm human, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen enough Academy incidents to write a textbook. "Report," she said simply. "Training exercise, Commander," Instructor Vexahal replied, though his mandibles were still twitching with agitation. "Standard grappling match that ended with unexpected results." Hale's gaze settled on Jamie, who had returned to her position at the edge of the ring as if nothing unusual had happened. "Corporal, would you care to explain how a routine sparring session resulted in one of our students requiring emergency medical attention?" Jamie came to attention with textbook precision. "The exercise proceeded according to regulations, Commander. My opponent initiated a grappling hold. I countered with a standard defensive technique, and the resulting impact caused an unfortunate injury. I take full responsibility for not controlling my response more carefully." It was a perfect military answer, technically accurate, appropriately contrite, and completely unhelpful for anyone trying to understand what had actually happened. Hale studied her for a long moment. "Standard defensive technique?" "Yes, ma'am. Basic counter-grappling, as taught in most colonial defense courses." "I see." Hale's expression suggested she was seeing quite a bit more than Jamie's words were revealing. "And where, exactly, did you learn these colonial defense techniques?" For the first time since the match began, Jamie hesitated. It was barely noticeable, a pause that lasted maybe half a second. But Holland caught it from the observation deck. "Kepler, 442B, ma'am. Mining colony security training." "Kepler, 442B," Hale repeated slowly. "The mining colony with the underground entertainment district." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Yes, ma'am." The pieces were falling into place now, and Holland could see the exact moment when Commander Hale connected the dots. Her expression shifted from professional curiosity to something considerably more intense. "Tell me, Corporal," she said, her voice taking on the kind of dangerous quiet that made smart people check their exit routes. "Did your security training at Kepler 442B include any experience with the local recreational facilities?" Jamie's military bearing never wavered, but Holland caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the conversation was heading somewhere she'd rather not go. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Commander." "The Darwin Pits," Hale said bluntly. "The illegal fighting rings where humans competed against captured alien predators for the entertainment of mining crews and smugglers. The ones that were shut down after footage leaked showing a human female defeating a Scarix warrior in single combat." The training hall had gone completely silent again. Even Gorthak, despite his obvious pain, was listening intently from where the medical team was working on his collarbone. Jamie's poker face was impressive, but not quite impressive enough. "I believe those facilities were shut down before I completed my training, Commander." "Indeed they were," Hale agreed. "Shut down after a joint Council Empire task force raided them following public outrage over the leaked footage." She paused, studying Jamie's face with the intensity of a scanner. "Footage that showed a young human woman, described in the reports as approximately 5.5 feet tall with brown hair, defeating 3 different alien opponents in the same night. The mathematical probability of coincidence hung in the air like an accusation." "Remarkable similarity," Jamie said carefully. "Though I imagine the description fits quite a few human females." "True," Hale acknowledged, though the reports also mentioned that this particular human had a very distinctive fighting style, something the investigators described as adaptive combat theory, the ability to analyze an opponent's natural advantages and turn them into weaknesses through superior understanding of physics and anatomy. Jamie said nothing, but her silence was more telling than any confession. Hale stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow managed to carry to every corner of the training hall. The reports also mentioned that this human had earned the nickname the Calculator among the regular spectators. Apparently, she had a habit of studying her opponents before matches, learning their movement patterns, their species' physiological limitations, their psychological tells. She gestured toward Gorthak, who was being carefully loaded onto a medical transport. The kind of study that would let someone know exactly where to strike a Scarix collarbone for maximum effect. Jamie's military composure finally cracked, just slightly. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Not apologetic or embarrassed, but something that looked almost like professional pride. "Hypothetically speaking, Commander," she said, "if someone had that kind of background, what would happen to them?" Hale's own smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Hypothetically, they'd probably find themselves transferred to advanced combat instruction, where their unique skill set could be properly utilized." She paused, looking around the circle of stunned students. "After all, the galaxy seems to have some misconceptions about human capabilities that need correcting." From the observation deck, Captain Holland found himself grinning despite the chaos below. Command hadn't sent Jamie to the academy to learn. They'd sent her to teach. 2 weeks later, the Apex Defense Institute had undergone what the administration euphemistically called curriculum restructuring. What they really meant was that someone had finally realized that their definition of proper combat technique might need some revision. Jamie stood at the front of Training Room C, facing a collection of alien cadets who looked like they were attending a lecture on existential philosophy rather than combat theory. The Vorthak warriors, those walking boulders with attitude problems, sat in the front row taking notes with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for disarming explosive devices. Behind them, the Shi'Tar assassins, who normally treated academic instruction like a personal insult, were actually leaning forward with something approaching interest. "The key to adaptive combat," Jamie explained, gesturing to a holographic display showing various alien anatomical structures, "isn't about being stronger or faster than your opponent. It's about understanding the fundamental principles that govern how bodies move through space. She highlighted the joint structure of a typical Centaurian warrior. Take our four-armed friends here. Massive reach advantage, incredible upper body strength, natural weapons that can punch through hull plating. Seems unbeatable, right? A few heads nodded around the room. Wrong. Jamie's smile was the kind that made smart people start checking their assumptions. All that mass requires more complex neural coordination. More joints mean more potential failure points. And that reach advantage? It works both ways. The farther your weapons are from your center of mass, the less leverage you have in close quarters. She touched a control, and the hologram shifted to show a combat scenario. Centaurian reaches for a grapple. You step inside their guard, and suddenly their greatest strength becomes their greatest weakness. They can't bring their full power to bear, and you're operating inside their decision loop. From the back of the room, Yenth raised one of his spindly arms. What about natural armor? Scarex scales, Delton crystal structures, that sort of thing. Excellent question. Jamie's expression suggested she'd been hoping someone would ask. Natural armor is designed to protect against specific types of damage, usually whatever their species evolved to fight against on their homeworld. But evolution is a reactive process. It responds to existing threats, not innovative ones. She pulled up another hologram, this one showing Gorthak's species in cross-section. Scarex scales are incredibly effective against slashing attacks and impact damage. They're designed to stop claws, teeth, and blunt force trauma. But they're not particularly good against rotational stress or leverage-based attacks. There was a shuffle from near the doorway, and Jamie looked up to see Gorthak himself entering the classroom. His right arm was still in a support brace, but he moved with the careful dignity of someone whose pride had taken even more damage than his collarbone. "Gorthak," Jamie said pleasantly. "How's the recovery going?" "Well enough," he replied, taking a seat in the back row with obvious reluctance. "I was told attendance at these sessions was recommended." Translation: Commander Hale had strongly suggested that anyone who wanted to avoid future embarrassment should probably learn what they were up against. "Perfect timing," Jamie said. "We were just discussing how natural advantages can become disadvantages under the right circumstances. Would you mind if I used our match as a case study?" Gorthak's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Proceed." Jamie turned back to the class, her demeanor shifting into full instructor mode. Standard Scarex combat doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force, applied through superior reach and strength. Grab the opponent, establish control, use leverage to end the fight quickly. It's effective because it works against most species most of the time. She highlighted the relevant portions of the holographic anatomy display, but it also creates predictable patterns. The initial grab has to be committed. You can't apply proper leverage with a half-hearted grip. That commitment creates a brief window where the attacker's balance and position are fixed. "So you used his own strength against him," observed one of the Vorthak warriors. His voice carried the kind of professional respect that suggested he was filing away this information for future reference. "Exactly. He grabbed my shoulder thinking he was controlling my movement, but really he was just giving me a fixed pivot point. Basic physics from there. Apply force at the right angle, and even a small impact can generate enormous stress on a joint structure." Gorthak shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," Jamie replied. "Simple physics, simple anatomy, simple cause and effect. The complexity comes from reading the situation quickly enough to apply the right technique at the right moment." She turned to address the entire class. That's what adaptive combat theory is really about: pattern recognition and creative problem-solving under pressure. Every species has evolutionary advantages, but every advantage comes with corresponding limitations. Your job is to identify those limitations and exploit them. From the doorway, Captain Holland watched the proceedings with something approaching paternal pride. The transformation in the classroom dynamics was remarkable. Students who'd spent weeks treating Jamie like a curiosity were now hanging on every word, taking notes, asking questions that suggested they were genuinely rethinking their approach to combat. After class, Holland intercepted Jamie in the corridor outside. "So," he said without preamble, "how many humans know these techniques?" Jamie's expression became carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean, Captain." "Come on, Jamie. We both know you weren't the only fighter in the Darwin pits. How many others are out there? How many humans have this kind of training?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. "More than you might think," she said finally. "The frontier colonies breed a certain type of person, Captain. People who learn to solve problems with whatever tools they have available." "And Command knows this?" Jamie's smile was sharp and knowing. "Why do you think they're suddenly so interested in expanding human recruitment quotas?" Holland felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air recycling system. "They're building something." "They're adapting," Jamie corrected. "The galaxy's changing, Captain. The old hierarchies, the traditional power structures, they're not as stable as everyone thinks. When that becomes common knowledge, it'll be useful to have people around who understand how to turn advantages into disadvantages." She started to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and, Captain, you might want to review the files on our next batch of transfer students, particularly the ones from the Rim colonies." Holland watched her disappear around the corner, then pulled up the transfer roster on his datapad. 3 more humans scheduled to arrive next month, all from frontier worlds, all with extensive military backgrounds and recommendations from officers he'd never heard of. He was beginning to suspect that the Apex Defense Institute's education was about to become significantly more comprehensive. And several species were about to learn that the galaxy's power structure was built on assumptions that humans seemed remarkably good at proving wrong. In the end, it wasn't about strength or natural weapons or evolutionary advantages. It was about understanding that every system had weaknesses, every hierarchy had vulnerabilities, and every predator eventually met something that refused to be prey. The galaxy was about to get a very expensive education in human adaptive capabilities. Class was just getting started.